In the autumn of 1888, in a forgotten corner of the American Midwest, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The small settlement of Crow Hollow, nestled between dense forests and rolling farmland in southern Illinois, was about to become the site of one of the most horrifying events in American frontier history, a night so drenched in blood that locals would whisper for generations that the soil itself had turned black, drinking until the first light of dawn broke the darkness. Crow Hollow was never meant to be more than a way station. Established in 1852 by German and Irish immigrants seeking fertile land away from the overcrowded eastern cities, it grew slowly into a community of approximately 200 souls. The settlement consisted of 30 farmsteads scattered across the valley, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, a small Lutheran church, and a one-room schoolhouse where children learned their letters under the stern gaze of Miss Adelaide Crane. The surrounding forests provided timber and game, while the rich black soil yielded corn, wheat and vegetables that sustained families through harsh winters. The Brennan family had been among the first settlers. Patrick Brennan arrived in 1853 with his young wife, Catherine, and together they carved a prosperous farm from the wilderness. By 1888, the Brennans were pillars of the community. Patrick, now 56 years old, served as the unofficial mayor, mediating disputes and organizing communal efforts like barn raisings and harvest festivals. Catherine ran the general store with meticulous care, keeping ledgers that tracked every transaction and debt in the settlement. Their eldest son, Thomas, 28 years old, worked the family farm with the strength and determination inherited from his father. Their daughter, Mary, 24, taught alongside Miss Crane at the schoolhouse, her gentle manner beloved by students and parents alike. The youngest, 16-year-old James, showed promise as a blacksmith's apprentice under the tutelage of Wilhelm Hoffmann, the burly German immigrant whose forge rang from dawn to dusk. Adjacent to the Brennan farm lived the Mueller family, Johannes, his wife Greta, and their 5 children. Johannes had emigrated from Bavaria in 1860, bringing with him old-world farming techniques that yielded impressive harvests. The Mullers and Brennans shared labor during busy seasons. Their children grew up together, and the families gathered for Sunday dinners after church services. Further down the valley road stood the O'Connor homestead, where widower Sean O'Connor raised his 3 daughters alone after his wife succumbed to influenza in 1884. Sean earned respect for his carpentry skills, and his eldest daughter, Bridget, 20 years old, had caught the attention of Thomas Brennan, their courtship the subject of approving nods from the community. But in the summer of 1888, something changed in Crow Hollow. It began subtly, like a discordant note in a familiar melody. Livestock started disappearing, first a few chickens from the Henderson farm, then a pig from the Mullers, then 2 of Sean O'Connor's goats. Patrick Brennan organized search parties, but they found no trace of the animals, no tracks, no signs of predators or thieves. Then came the mutilations. Wilhelm Hoffmann discovered one of his horses in the pasture. Its throat opened clean, the blood drained so completely that the ground around the carcass remained dry. 2 days later, Johannes Mueller found 3 of his sheep slaughtered in the same manner, their bodies arranged in a strange pattern that made his skin crawl. The incidents escalated. Tools went missing from barns. Fences were torn down overnight. Strange symbols appeared carved into tree trunks at the edge of the settlement, crude markings that resembled no language anyone recognized. Miss Crane reported seeing figures moving through the forest at twilight, shapes that seemed human, but moved with an unnatural gait. The children began having nightmares, waking their parents with screams about shadow people watching from the woods. Patrick called a town meeting in late August. The settlers gathered in the church, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. Some demanded they form armed patrols. Others suggested sending for the county sheriff, though the nearest town with law enforcement was 2 days' ride away. A few whispered about abandoning Crow Hollow altogether, packing their belongings and starting fresh elsewhere. Patrick urged calm, reminding them that they had built their homes with their own hands, that this land belonged to them, and that whatever troubled their settlement could be faced together. They agreed to establish night watches, with men taking turns guarding the perimeter. For a week, the watches reported nothing unusual. The incidents seemed to stop. Hope began to return. Perhaps it had been wild animals after all, or drifters who had moved on. Perhaps the nightmares had been collective hysteria, the product of isolated lives and overactive imaginations. Then came the night of September 15th. Thomas Brennan was on watch duty, patrolling the southern edge of the settlement with his rifle cradled in his arms. The moon hung full and heavy in the sky, casting silver light across the fields. The air was still unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no owl calls, no rustling of nocturnal creatures. Thomas felt the silence pressing against his eardrums like water. He stopped near the old oak tree that marked the boundary between the Brennan and Mueller properties, listening intently. That was when he heard it, a low, rhythmic sound coming from the direction of the Mueller house. At first, he thought it might be singing, but as he moved closer, the sound resolved into something else entirely. A chant, multiple voices speaking in unison, words he could not understand. Thomas broke into a run, his boots pounding against the earth. As he crested the small hill that overlooked the Mueller farm, he stopped dead in his tracks. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his days. The Mueller farmhouse was ablaze with torchlight. Figures moved in the yard, at least a dozen of them, dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by crude masks made from burlap and leather. They surrounded the family, who knelt in the dirt with their hands bound behind their backs. Johannes Meller's face was bloodied, his eyes swollen shut. Greta clutched her youngest child, a boy of 6, while her other children huddled close to their father. The masked figures continued their chanting, swaying in rhythm, some holding torches while others wielded axes and knives. Thomas raised his rifle, his hands shaking so violently he could barely aim. He fired a shot into the air, hoping to scatter them. The chanting stopped. Every masked head turned toward him. For a moment, everything froze. Then one of the figures, taller than the others, wearing a mask with antlers attached, pointed at Thomas and shouted a command. Half the group broke away and began running up the hill toward him. Thomas ran. He sprinted back toward the Brennan farm, screaming for his father, for anyone who could hear. Behind him he heard the pounding of feet, the shouts of his pursuers. He reached the farmhouse and burst through the door, slamming it shut and throwing the bolt. Patrick was already awake, awakened by the gunshot. Thomas gasped out what he had seen, his words tumbling over each other. Patrick grabbed his own rifle and roused James from his bed. Catherine lit every lamp in the house while Mary barricaded the windows with furniture. They heard the attackers arrive, surrounding the house, their boots crunching on gravel. The chanting resumed, louder now, accompanied by the sound of axe blades striking wood. They were testing the door, the walls, looking for weakness. Patrick positioned himself at the front window, rifle aimed at the shadows moving outside. He shouted warnings demanding they leave or face deadly force. The response was laughter. Cold, mocking laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The siege lasted 2 hours. The attackers never breached the house, but they made their presence known. They threw rocks at the windows, set fire to the barn, slaughtered the livestock in the yard. The Brennans could hear their animals screaming, the wet sounds of blades cutting flesh. At one point, someone began pounding on the back door with such force that the wood cracked. James fired through the door, and the pounding stopped, followed by a howl of pain. Finally, near midnight, the sounds ceased. The attackers withdrew into the darkness, their torches disappearing into the forest like dying stars. Patrick kept watch until dawn, refusing to lower his weapon, while his family huddled together in the center of the room. When the first grey light of morning broke through the windows, he finally allowed himself to breathe. They emerged from the house to find devastation. The barn was a smoking ruin. 12 cows, 3 horses, and countless chickens lay butchered in the yard, their blood soaking the earth. But what made Patrick's blood run cold was the message left on the front door. Carved deep into the wood were words written in English. "The earth hungers. Feed it, or join it." Thomas insisted they go immediately to the Mueller farm. Patrick tried to stop him, fearing what they might find, but Thomas would not be deterred. He grabbed a shovel and a lantern and started down the road. Patrick and James followed, weapons ready. The sun was rising as they approached the Mueller property, painting the sky in shades of amber and red. The farmhouse stood intact, smoke rising from the chimney as if nothing had happened. For a moment, hope flickered in Thomas's chest. Perhaps the Muellers had fought off their attackers as the Brennans had. Perhaps they had survived. Then they entered the yard and saw the bodies. The Mueller family had been arranged in a circle in front of their home. Johannes lay in the center, his throat cut from ear to ear. Greta and the children surrounded him, positioned like points on a compass. Each had been killed in the same manner, quick, efficient cuts that had bled them completely. The earth beneath them was black with blood. A circle perhaps 20 feet across, the soil so saturated it had turned to mud. But what made the scene truly nightmarish were the symbols. Someone had used the blood to paint markings on the ground around the bodies, intricate patterns that spiraled outward from the circle of corpses. The same strange symbols they had seen carved into trees now covered the Möller farmhouse, painted in blood across the white clapboard siding. Thomas fell to his knees and vomited. James turned away, tears streaming down his face. Patrick stood frozen, his mind trying to process what his eyes were seeing, trying to make sense of the senseless. They buried the Muellers that afternoon in the church cemetery. Every surviving settler attended, standing in silent horror as Pastor Friedrich spoke words of comfort that rang hollow in the autumn air. Some families began packing immediately after the service, loading wagons with whatever possessions they could carry. Patrick tried to convince them to stay, to band together, but fear had taken root too deep. By evening, 15 families had departed Crow Hollow, their wagons forming a solemn procession down the valley road. Those who remained, perhaps 80 souls, gathered again in the church. Patrick proposed they send riders to the county seat to bring back the sheriff and as many deputies as could be spared. Sean O'Connor and 2 other men volunteered to go, leaving at first light. That left the settlement vulnerable, but there was no choice. They needed help beyond what they could provide themselves. The next 3 nights passed without incident. Guards maintained constant watch, rotating in shifts so no one was left alone. Some settlers slept in the church, reasoning that sacred ground might offer protection. Others fortified their homes, nailing boards across windows and doors, keeping weapons loaded and within reach. The children were kept indoors, forbidden from playing outside or attending school. The settlement had become a prison, fear the jailer. On the 4th night, the attackers returned. They came not as a group, but as individuals, infiltrating the settlement like poison seeping into the bloodstream. The Hendersons were murdered in their sleep, discovered only when smoke from their burning home alerted neighbors. The Schultz family was found in their barn, hung from the rafters. The pattern was clear: isolate and eliminate, picking off families one by one, spreading terror with each kill. By dawn, 7 more families had been slaughtered. The survivors gathered in the church, barricading themselves inside, too terrified to return to their homes. Patrick counted heads. 43 people remained, mostly women and children. The men who were still alive formed a defensive line around the church, armed with whatever weapons they possessed. Mary tended to the wounded, using torn bedsheets as bandages, her hands stained red despite repeated washing. The younger children huddled in the corner near the altar, silent and hollow-eyed, their innocence forever shattered by what they had witnessed. Outside, the settlement burned. The attackers had set fire to abandoned homes, and thick black smoke rose into the morning sky like funeral pyres. Thomas stood at the window, watching the destruction of everything his family had built over 35 years. The general store was ablaze, Catherine's carefully maintained ledgers turning to ash. The schoolhouse collapsed in on itself, timbers cracking like gunshots. Even the blacksmith's forge had been vandalized, tools scattered and Wilhelm Hoffmann's body hanging from the rafters, a grim warning painted in blood on the wall behind him. Pastor Friedrich attempted to lead the survivors in prayer, but his voice cracked and failed. How could God allow this? What sin had they committed to deserve such punishment? Some of the women wept openly. Others sat in numb silence, cradling their children, rocking back and forth, as if motion could somehow protect them from the nightmare surrounding them. The men discussed options in hushed tones. They could try to break through and flee, but with so many women and children they would be easy targets. They could fortify the church and wait for Sean O'Connor to return with help, but that assumed he had survived his journey, and that help would arrive in time. They could surrender, though what mercy might be shown by people capable of such atrocities seemed unlikely. Patrick made the decision. They would hold the church. The building was solid stone, with only 2 entrances and windows high enough to make forced entry difficult. They had enough food for perhaps 2 days if they rationed carefully. Water was the concern. They had only what remained in the canteens they had brought, and the well was 50 yards away across open ground. As the sun climbed higher, an eerie quiet settled over Crow Hollow. The fires burned themselves out, leaving skeletal remains of buildings standing like tombstones. No attackers appeared. No sounds came from the surrounding forest. The silence felt oppressive, heavy with anticipation. Thomas volunteered to make a run for the well. Patrick objected, but Thomas was adamant. They needed water, and he was the fastest runner among them. He would go at midday when the sun was highest, reducing shadows where attackers might hide. He stripped off his jacket to move more freely, took the largest bucket they had, and positioned himself at the door. Patrick and 2 other men covered him with rifles. At precisely noon, Thomas burst from the church and sprinted toward the well. His boots pounded against the earth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every muscle tensed for the impact of a bullet or blade. He reached the well, lowered the bucket with shaking hands, hauled up the water, and turned to run back. That was when he saw them. They stood at the edge of the forest, perhaps 20 figures in their masks and dark clothing, watching him. They made no move to attack, simply stood there, perfectly still, like statues carved from shadow. Thomas ran faster than he had ever run in his life, water sloshing from the bucket, his heart hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. He crashed through the church door and collapsed, gasping, while Patrick and the others slammed it shut and threw the bolt. When they looked through the windows, the figures had vanished. The incident repeated itself throughout the afternoon. Whenever someone approached a window, they would see the attackers standing at various points around the settlement, near the ruined general store, beside the burned schoolhouse, at the entrance to the valley road. They never moved closer. They simply watched, their presence a constant reminder that escape was impossible, that the survivors were trapped like animals in a pen. As evening approached, the temperature dropped. Someone had the presence of mind to grab blankets during the chaos, and these were distributed among the children and elderly. The church had no stove, no fireplace, and lighting a fire would have been dangerous in any case, marking their position more clearly. They huddled together for warmth, whispering prayers and memories, trying to comfort each other with words that rang increasingly hollow. Mary found herself sitting beside Bridget O'Connor, Sean's daughter, who had been at the Brennan house when the attacks began. Bridget stared at nothing, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. Mary tried to engage her in conversation, but Bridget only nodded or shook her head, her voice seemingly lost. The trauma had stolen something essential from her, leaving behind a shell that breathed but no longer truly lived. As darkness fell, they heard the chanting begin again. It came from all directions, surrounding the church, the same rhythmic, incomprehensible words they had heard before. The sound rose and fell like waves, sometimes loud enough to shake the windows, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers. The children began to cry, and their mothers covered their ears, singing lullabies to drown out the unholy chorus outside. Patrick gathered the men at the front of the church. They needed a plan. He proposed that at first light, the strongest among them would attempt a breakout. They would load the women and children into the church wagon, create a distraction at the rear of the building to draw the attackers, and then make a run for the valley road. It was desperate, likely to fail, but remaining meant certain death when their water and food ran out. The men agreed. They spent the next hours preparing, fashioning crude weapons from church pews, filling every container with the remaining water, gathering what little food they had into sacks. Some wrote letters to family members who might still be alive elsewhere, messages they hoped would somehow reach their destinations. Others sharpened knives on the stone floor, the scraping sound adding to the nightmarish symphony of chanting outside. Thomas sat with his father near the altar. They spoke quietly about the farm, about the good years and the hard ones, about Thomas's mother and siblings. Patrick placed his hand on his son's shoulder and told him he was proud of the man he had become. Thomas felt tears burning his eyes, but refused to let them fall. There would be time for grief later, if they survived. If they survived. At midnight, the chanting stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. They waited, weapons ready, expecting an assault. None came. An hour passed. 2. The tension became unbearable. Then they heard a new sound, scratching, like claws or fingernails dragging across stone. It came from the walls, from the roof, from beneath the floorboards. Rats, someone suggested, though the sound seemed too deliberate, too organized. The scratching grew louder, accompanied by whispers too soft to understand. Some of the survivors began to scream. Others prayed more loudly, their voices rising in desperation. Pastor Friedrich stood and raised his Bible, shouting verses about protection and deliverance, but his words were swallowed by the cacophony. Then, with shocking suddenness, everything stopped. The scratching ceased. The whispers faded. The church fell into absolute silence. Even the survivors stopped their prayers and screams, held in suspended animation by the unnatural quiet. They waited, barely breathing, for whatever would come next. What came was a voice, a single voice, speaking in perfect English, coming from directly outside the front door. The voice was calm, almost pleasant, like a neighbor stopping by for conversation. It asked if they were comfortable, if they had enough provisions, if the children were warm enough. Patrick refused to respond. The voice continued, explaining that the settlement had been built on sacred ground, that the earth beneath them demanded payment for the intrusion. The early disappearances of livestock had been warnings, offerings made to satisfy the land's hunger. But the settlers had not understood. They had not left. So more substantial offerings became necessary. The voice described in detail what had been done to the Muller family, to the Hendersons, to Wilhelm Hoffmann and the others. It spoke of blood soaking into soil, of life force being absorbed by the earth, of ancient contracts being fulfilled. Patrick finally responded, shouting that they were innocent people, that they had done no wrong, that they had every right to their homes and land. The voice laughed softly. Rights were human constructs, it explained. The earth recognized only hunger and satiation. The settlers had one choice: walk out of the church and offer themselves peacefully, ensuring quick deaths, or be taken when the church's defenses finally failed. Patrick's answer was a rifle shot through the door. The voice went silent. For several minutes nothing happened. Then the scratching began again, but this time focused on the door itself. They were trying to break through. The men reinforced the entrance with pews, creating a barricade. The scratching moved to the windows. Stones began flying through the glass, accompanied by bottles filled with burning oil. The fires were small and quickly extinguished, but they served their purpose, spreading chaos and fear among the defenders. A bottle landed near the children, and Mary threw herself on it, smothering the flames with a blanket. Her hands burned, the skin blistering instantly, but she made no sound. Bridget snapped out of her stupor and rushed to help, wrapping Mary's hands with strips of cloth torn from her own dress. The attack intensified. Axes began hacking at the wooden door. The barricade held, but barely. The men fired through gaps in the pews, and screams from outside indicated some shots found targets. But for every attacker who fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. The siege had become a war of attrition, and the defenders were losing. James, the youngest Brennan, suddenly stood and announced he had an idea. There was a root cellar beneath the church, accessed through a trap door behind the altar. He had played in it as a child during long sermons. The cellar had a tunnel. Not a proper tunnel, but a drainage channel that extended out past the church's foundation, emerging in a gully about 30 yards away. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, but it might offer escape. Patrick demanded to know why James had not mentioned this earlier. James admitted he had forgotten about it, his mind clouded by fear, but seeing Mary burned had jolted the memory free. They had no time to debate. The door was splintering under the axe blows. Patrick made the decision. The women and children would go through the tunnel first, led by James. The men would remain behind, maintaining the defense to prevent the attackers from realizing what was happening. Once the vulnerable were clear, the men would follow, collapsing the tunnel behind them to prevent pursuit. It was still desperate, still likely to fail, but it offered something the alternative did not: hope. The trapdoor was heavy, swollen with decades of moisture, and required 4 men to lift. Beneath was darkness and the smell of earth and decay. James lowered himself in, found the drainage channel, and called up that it seemed passable. They began moving people down, children first, handed carefully into the darkness, then the women, then the elderly. Mary refused to go until everyone else was safe, despite her burned hands. Bridget worked beside her, organizing the evacuation with surprising efficiency, her earlier catatonia replaced by focused determination. Above them, the church door was failing. Splinters flew inward. They could see fingers reaching through the gaps, pulling at the barricade. Patrick and Thomas fired their last rounds through the openings, buying precious seconds. Then the door gave way. The attackers poured in, masks illuminated by torchlight, weapons raised. Patrick screamed for the remaining defenders to retreat to the altar. They fell back, fighting hand to hand, using pews as shields and improvised clubs. Pastor Friedrich swung his heavy Bible like a weapon, catching an attacker across the face with enough force to shatter the mask. Thomas saw his father go down, an axe blade catching him in the shoulder. He screamed and rushed forward, but James grabbed him and shoved him toward the trapdoor. There was no time for rescue. Patrick was lost. They had to save who they could. Thomas fought against his brother, but James was stronger in that moment, fueled by desperation. He forced Thomas through the opening and followed, pulling the trapdoor shut above them. They heard the thud of boots on the floor above, heard screams and the wet sounds of violence. Then James was pushing Thomas forward into the drainage channel, into the narrow darkness that reeked of mold and stagnant water. They crawled. The tunnel was even tighter than James remembered, the walls pressing against their shoulders, the ceiling low enough that they had to keep their heads down. Behind them, they heard pounding on the trapdoor. The attackers had found it. Thomas wanted to go back, to fight, to die with his father, but James kept pushing him forward, whispering fiercely that their father's sacrifice would mean nothing if they did not survive. The tunnel seemed endless, a claustrophobic nightmare of stone and earth. Water dripped from above, cold and foul. Things skittered away from their hands, rats or insects, impossible to tell. Then suddenly fresh air. The tunnel opened into the gully, and they emerged into the pre-dawn darkness like creatures being born from the earth itself. Around them, the other survivors were gathering. 31 people, all that remained of Crow Hollow's 200 souls. They were covered in mud, bleeding, traumatized beyond measure, but alive. James did a quick count. His father was not there. Neither were 4 other men who had stayed behind to buy time. Mary was there, her hands wrapped in bloody cloth. Bridget was there, holding 2 young children who were not her own. Pastor Friedrich had made it out, his Bible still clutched in his hands. They could hear sounds from the church, triumphant shouts, the crashing of furniture being overturned. Any moment, the attackers would realize their prey had escaped. James took charge, his voice steady despite the horror. They would move into the forest, using the trees for cover. They would head east, toward the main road, and pray they encountered Sean O'Connor returning with help. They moved as quickly as the children and elderly could manage, leaving behind the only home most of them had ever known. As the sun rose, they looked back one final time. Crow Hollow was burning. Every building had been set ablaze, the flames rising high into the morning sky. The church was an inferno, its stone walls glowing red with heat. The settlement that had taken 36 years to build was being erased in a single night. Thomas felt something break inside him, not grief, not yet, but a hollow numbness that would take years to understand and decades to heal. They walked for 6 hours before they heard horses. The survivors scattered into the underbrush, terrified it might be the attackers pursuing them, but the voices that called out were familiar. Sean O'Connor had returned with the county sheriff and 20 deputized men. He had left 3 days earlier, ridden hard through day and night, and convinced the authorities that something terrible was happening. The posse had encountered the exodus of families who had fled earlier, families who described the killings and the terror. Armed with this testimony, the sheriff had gathered every able-bodied man willing to ride to Crow Hollow's aid. They arrived too late to save the settlement, but just in time to save the survivors. The sheriff organized an immediate pursuit of the attackers, but found nothing. The masked figures had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The only evidence of their presence was the devastation itself. The burned buildings, the mass grave where they buried 43 victims, the blood-stained earth that would grow nothing for 3 years afterward. Investigation revealed no clear motive, no identification of the killers, no resolution that might bring peace to the traumatized survivors. Some speculated it was a cult that had taken root in the region, twisted individuals who had descended into madness and murder. Others believed it was revenge for some unknown transgression, real or imagined. A few whispered about darker possibilities, that the voice speaking outside the church had been telling the truth, that the land itself had demanded blood, that some places in America carried memories and hungers older than any human settlement. The survivors scattered across the country, few of them ever speaking publicly about what happened. Thomas Brennan moved to Chicago, working in a factory, drinking to forget, dying young of liver failure in 1903. Mary Brennan became a teacher in St. Louis, dedicating her life to children, her scarred hands hidden beneath gloves even in summer. She never married, never returned to Illinois, and when she died in 1941, her belongings included a small wooden box containing soil from Crow Hollow, labeled simply Remember. James Brennan went west, joining the cavalry, fighting in the Indian Wars, seeking violence because it was the only thing that made sense after what he had witnessed. He survived to old age living on a ranch in Montana, telling his grandchildren stories about his childhood that carefully excluded the autumn of 1888. Bridget O'Connor married a widower in Indiana, raised his children alongside her own, and became known for her charity work with orphans and displaced families. She never spoke of Crow Hollow, but was heard to say once that home was not a place but the people you chose to protect. The settlement itself was never rebuilt. The land was deemed cursed by locals, and no one would purchase it despite attractive prices. Eventually, the forest reclaimed what remained, trees growing through foundations, vines covering the cemetery stones. By 1920, Crow Hollow had been forgotten by all but a few historians and the descendants of survivors who carried the story like an inherited wound. The earth that had drunk so deeply that autumn morning retained its darkness, the soil black and rich, as if fed by something more than rain and time. And on certain autumn nights when the moon hangs full and heavy, locals in the surrounding counties report hearing chanting coming from the direction of the old settlement. Rhythmic, incomprehensible words carried on the wind, a reminder that some hungers are never fully satisfied, that some debts can never truly be paid, and that the earth remembers everything, drinking until dawn comes to wash away the evidence, but never the truth. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.